For instance, my neighbors, I have no idea if they're Democrats or Republicans. I know that they're good people. They're going to watch my house when I'm out. If my dog runs away or my kids get locked out, they're going to be there for me. But that's just getting back to being human. And when we can slow down and focus on just being human again, I think we can really get things done.
The Bard told us, all the world's a stage, my friends, and all the men and women in it are merely players. We ask our elected officials to play two roles, to be our partisan heroes, winning elections for our side, but also then to put partisanship aside and become our community heroes, somehow working for the common good. If we the people are so partisanly divided we don't want to compromise with the other side, how can we expect our elected officials to be able to do so? San Diego holds nonpartisan elections. We elect the city attorney, the mayor, the city council without reference to political party. But is that really possible in such a hyper-partisan age that we find ourselves living in? A partisan age that is amplified by a media that is always looking for conflict. We recently spoke with City Attorney Mara Elliott about her successes and sometimes her failures in trying to transcend politics. Mara Elliott, thank you for joining us on Keep It Civil San Diego. We're talking about how do you transcend partisanship, and we're in a hyper-partisan age. I was just seeing a survey in The Economist magazine that said that large numbers of both parties and the majorities of one in particular questions even the patriotism of people on the other side. Mm-hmm. People just can't seem to bridge that partisan difference where before there may have been some overlap. You're, in theory, a nonpartisan office holder. How is that possible in such a hyper-partisan age?
Well, I think it's easier for an attorney because we know what our professional rules of ethics require. Our job is to study issues and give our clients the best information they can so they can make very difficult decisions. But I'm seeing that trickle that you're describing even in our day-to-day world where our analysis is questioned because I happen to be a Democrat. But I serve the city of San Diego. It doesn't matter to me if somebody's a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. I serve the entire city. But there's always that question, where is this coming from? Is this truly a legal analysis or is it something else? And I just think that that comes down to what we're seeing every day, whether we're questioning the basic facts. Is that the truth? I think we sometimes even question that. You're seeing it on the news. You're seeing it with legal decisions that are coming out of courts. And everybody's very skeptical and they don't know who to trust. But being a lawyer is really, it's a lot easier because we have one job to do, and that is to give good legal advice, try to save money when we can do that, protect taxpayers. When we're lucky, we get to do some of our priority projects, like some of what you heard about in my background, whether it's protecting seniors or working on domestic violence and sex trafficking to prevent that in our region.
But do you sometimes feel like the referee in a high school basketball game, that no matter what you do at any given time, half the audience is yelling, you're brilliant or you're a crook?
Oh, always. I think that's the nature of what I'm doing, especially when it's so public. The decisions that we make in the office impact the air you breathe, the water you drink, the roads you drive on, whether you can play in a park on the weekend or visit the library. So we have a very real role in everybody's lives, and I think that you are in the line of fire. So when services get cut or somebody doesn't like a decision that's being made, of course somebody that's been elected is going to be held accountable for that. So I try to approach my job as being the adult in the room, the person who doesn't get worked up over silly things. I think being a parent has been very helpful because I go home and I deal with a lot of the same issues that I deal with in my day-to-day job. A lot of emotions, a lot of rushing to judgment. But what I try to do is get people to sit down and talk to each other and understand what one another's role is really like, what their world is like. The decisions we make may have an operational impact, and I need to understand that. And when I do my job best, I feel like I've been able to communicate all of those things and then wrap it into a legal analysis and help our client get to the best decision that they can for the city, because that's what it's about.
Of course, being the adult in the room is good, but I quit being a Little League coach, but not because of the kids, but because of the adults.
Yeah,
They-
I can see that.
Yeah, they were causing more grief than anything, again, about their side versus the other side, because it comes down to that sense of winning and losing.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody wants their prayers to be answered and doesn't like it when the answer is no. How do you communicate that you may have lost today, but maybe tomorrow you win, that eventually everybody in a city of San Diego comes out a winner from these decisions beyond partisanship?
Well, that's not always easy, because I think oftentimes it is about the win, but trying to convince people that winning looks different sometimes. And my approach to the job is not to necessarily come out with a no, because very infrequent is it for it to be a no answer. It has to be pretty much illegal. And we will do a risk analysis and give the city leaders the opportunity to weigh what they want to do. So is this really risky, and is this not so risky? And they get that opportunity to weigh in and come to hopefully a reasoned judgment. And at the end of the day, when you've got 9 council members voting on something, we usually come to something that really does reflect what people want. But I think the hardest part is making sure the communication is there, because we forget to do that. And I think that really building trust and keeping matters civil requires that you hear one another and understand where they're coming from instead of trying to rush to a win. The win often requires that 9 folks work well together, and that I'm able to serve as someone they trust who can give them information they need.
And then the 9 that you serve have to go back to the people they serve and explain to them why they did what they did. And that's sometimes when partisanship can come into the whole matter.
Right.
So like many of the things you've worked on in your career, gun safety, stopping human trafficking, protecting the elderly, protecting children. You'd think those would all be kind of no-brainers. Everybody agrees on it. But when you're working at one level, coming up with ideas, you can reach some sort of consensus. But what happens when it gets out there into the world of the political?
Well, that's a great question. So the safe storage of firearms ordinance was something that was just raised as part of my priority and my background. And that came to us through a grassroots effort. It was an idea that came to us from the community. Folks feel that if you don't have your firearm on your person or within your immediate control, it should be locked up. And there's a lot of data that shows that children in particular know where their parents keep the firearms, so you want to lock them up. And we had a tragedy in my own community, and I never wanted to read about that or have that happen on my watch. So I think most people agree that locking up firearms when they're not within your control or on your person is a good idea. But when it came to council, despite all of the testimony, it was very clear that people had already made up their minds before they even heard from the public. And the question becomes why? It's not that we have certain people that care less about kids. That's not it at all. What it is politics, because, and I'm picking on my Republican colleagues who I know have good hearts, but it's almost taboo for them to support a restriction on how they handle their firearms. And during this course of presenting this proposal, the chair of the Republican Party was on Twitter saying, "What's the city attorney doing? She's infringing." So that is a political perspective on a very common sense issue, where I think if we could have just been ourselves, we'd all agree that this is a really important measure and it's going to protect our kids. But unfortunately, the politics stepped in. Now, at the end of this, we got the law that we wanted on the books. I feel like we're keeping kids safer, and other San Diego cities are adopting our same firearm storage ordinance, but they didn't have the same controversy that we did. We had hours of testimony, very public, through a couple of council committees and then city council. So it was very widely discussed, but there still was that mistrust, the politics, when really all we were talking about was child safety.
And I guess that goes to that old philosophical statement that truth goes through 3 stages.
Yeah.
It's ridiculed, it's violently repressed, and then it's accepted as self-evident. So once you get it through one group, it's easier to get it through others. And I'm sure you probably have similar stories of, say, Democrats in the city council, things that they have to politicize to go back to their constituents. How do you get beyond that sort of the political theater on the big issues? I mean, once it hits media, once it hits Twitter, how do you pull it back so it can be a more reasoned debate?
I think that's a very difficult thing for people to do. And part of my job is trying to find that middle ground and present information in a way where And I'm talking about the council in particular, where they have very different regions. They each have different districts. Now, what happens in District 1, the La Jolla area, is very different than what could be happening in District 8. And they need to be able to explain to their constituents why they made the decisions that they made. And I think when I can help them have those conversations and better explain themselves, and that might be through issuing, let's say, a legal memorandum. And I'm thinking maybe about the citizens initiatives that we voted on last year with the stadium site. Writing those very thorough reports that describe pros and cons of a deal gave everybody something that they could sink their teeth into. So if a council member had a district that was interested in particular aspects, we covered it, and that gave them an ability to explain themselves in a way that makes sense to their communities. And I think that's a really good way for a lawyer to protect our client in a way that we're not only giving good legal advice, but giving them an ability to communicate with the people they serve.
And with that, I guess the old expression, all politics is local, is an assist to you, that people can understand their locality beyond politics, like filling potholes, fixing streets,
Right.
and infrastructure. But even then, it's often said, the filling potholes isn't political. Of course it is. Do you have the tax revenues to be able to fill the potholes?
Yeah.
Do you use labor unions? Do you use right to work forces? How do you do these things? At the national level, this has become almost paralyzing.
Right.
Do you think this is getting worse in San Diego, or so far are we able to stem that partisan tide enough to at least keep the city working better than the national level?
Well, we're still working fairly well, but I think that there is more discussion than there used to be, maybe a little bit more skepticism, digging feet in the sand a bit more, but I just think that there's a trickle down from the federal level that's really impacting the local level. And I'll just give you for example. When I became city attorney, I brought a couple of amicus requests, and that's a friend of the court opportunity where the city can say this is a local concern, we want our voices heard, we're going to submit a letter for or against a certain case, and we've got a couple that have made their way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But that was seen by certain individuals as a political hot button because we've never weighed in on what they consider to be federal issues. But here, these are very real issues for people in San Diego. One concerned LGBTQ employment rights, the other concerned people who are DACA eligible. And those are now both before the U.S. Supreme Court, but we have constituencies who really care about those issues. But it became very political, and that's probably because this is somewhat of a new issue for San Diego. So I think with time we have to adjust and try to figure out what it is that the people who elect us want us to do. And I think it's a growing issue for all of us because politics have changed tremendously, even in the 3 years that I have been in office.
Yeah, how so?
Well, I think it's because, for one, I used to hear council members say this a lot, we're responsible for filling potholes or making sure that our services are being provided in the way that people expect us to. But now the issues are far more global, and you look at like the Tijuana sewage emergency. That is really a federal issue that's having a local impact. So as local politicians and as their lawyer, we're looking at issues that are much greater than we ever thought about before. We're a border city, and we have people that are coming over and they're working here or they're buying our products. That's bigger than we are used to looking at as a city. So we have to grow with the times, and that's requiring us to have a bigger footprint.
There's C40 has been talking about this, the 40 big cities around the world unified on environmental matters. Is San Diego becoming more engaged with
like a regional
type
approach?
Regional, but where you have basically city governments addressing problems in tandem to try to get around the fact their national governments don't. Do you see that as something that's been happening more in San Diego?
Oh, totally. Yeah, and gun violence restraining orders are a perfect example of that. So we have an epidemic of gun violence, and I think there's a lot of frustration that at the federal level nothing is getting done. But at the city level, we've been able to do a lot. So there's a new law, relatively new law, that's been on the books for a few years in the city of San Diego, because it was a priority for me, embraced that opportunity and started to enforce gun violence restraining order laws, which is a red flag law. And if we identify somebody who's a danger to themselves or others and they have access to a gun, we can remove it before a tragedy occurs. And I think a lot of folks thought we couldn't ever do something like that at a municipal level. But in my mind, that's where a city is stepping in and doing what we expected the feds to do, yet they have declined to do so. So we've had a very big impact, not just locally, but throughout the state of California, because we've trained law enforcement agencies up and down the state of California, and they've been able to adopt their own plans, their own programs to reduce gun violence. So that's how I think it's changing. I think that people expect results, and we as local politicians should be looking for ways to fill that gap when nobody else is doing that. So it takes an ability to work together, to be creative, to be looking for ways to solve problems. And I think we're moving in that direction, and I think it's a good thing.
Municipalities of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your paralysis.
Yes.
That's an interesting model for 21st century governance, but it still depends on being able to transcend political theater. You've kind of touched on some examples of when you've been successful in doing that. Do you have another good example of how you were able to, when something got politicized, move it back into the realm of compromise, community?
Well, we do that every day. I think that the stadium example is a good one with the citizens' initiatives. There were council members that were very excited about one proposal over another, council members that maybe didn't like anything very much. But I think that we have been working very well together to try to find solutions because and I think this is a maturity in politics, try to figure out what your region needs and figure out how to get there and put the swiping aside. And sometimes it takes a little time. So I see this at council meetings where folks will express their frustration or poke at somebody, but eventually they're going to knock it off and we're going to roll up our sleeves and get things done. So I think that there has to be not only communication, but there has to be some patience with the process because people express themselves different. They build trust different and they get to conclusions at their own pace. And I think we're seeing that with a lot of our large projects that are happening in San Diego right now.
Yeah, complexity is its own thing to be able to bring everybody along. How about an example where you just weren't able to transcend the political, that it was something that you knew should be done, could be done, but just ran into that wall of political noise?
You know, I'm not seeing that yet, and I have to say that I'm one of those people that doesn't give up. I sort of see a house with all its windows and doors locked, and I'll run around until I can find an opening and get into the house. A good example is during the election, there was one particular person that is very well known in town, and he supported my opponent. And you would think that we never would have talked. He couldn't be more far opposite of me politically. But we were able to find one area where we agreed, and that was on the prevention of human trafficking. So I asked him, would you like to have a cup of coffee with me? And he did, and I don't think anybody ever would have thought that we'd have coffee together. And we did, and now we've got this relationship that I think is really benefiting our region. But that's because we both reached out to one another, identified the common ground, and worked together. So I can't think of a time where I just gave up or shut down because I'm not going to allow that to happen. I think we have a lot we can do when we work together. And I think most people, you know, politicians get a bad rap, but they don't earn much money. The folks I work with don't. And I think they mean well. But sometimes it takes us a little time to get to that result.
But I like your formulation, basically meet together, talk together, do something about it.
Yep.
How can we foster more of that in our community, not just in the governmental level, but across our communities? I mean, we got a lot more in common with each other, Republican, Democrat, Independent, than we don't. How do we stress that?
I think by listening and trying to understand the other person. For instance, my neighbors, I have no idea if they're Democrats or Republicans. I know that they're good people. They're going to watch my house when I'm out. If my dog runs away or my kids get locked out, they're going to be there for me. But that's just getting back to being human and recognizing that we all are basically the same. We want to be important. We want to be heard. We want to contribute. And trying to find a way to do that, I think, is really worth the time. And when we can slow down and focus on just being human again, I think we can really get things done.
And then everybody gets the positive payoff that's required to make everybody play the game.
Yeah.
If you could wave a magic wand, what might be one little thing you'd fix in our political system to change that, to make it more possible?
Well, boy, that's a really difficult question. I think that if we could have more public meetings, like when you can really go into people's neighborhoods and hear directly from them, I wish there was more time, more resources to do that, more avenues to do that, because I have learned in my 3 short years that my priorities must change because people change, circumstances change, and every time I go into a neighborhood or a community meeting and hear from people what really impacts their lives, it helps me figure out what's important and where to put my resources, because that's why I'm serving. And I think most of us are serving for that very reason, is we want to make our neighborhoods better. We want our communities to be a place we want to raise our children. Just getting back to the basics and talking and listening.
Yeah, we all live in our own bubbles, but your goal is to make the bubbles bigger to bring everybody in.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you for being on Keep It Civil San Diego and
Thank
for
you.
keeping it civil. Thank you, City Attorney Mara Elliott.
Thank you, Carl.
The Bard tells us the fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. How can we expect our elected officials to put partisanship aside and work together unless we're willing to have conversations with people we don't agree with to get things done? So here's your homework, San Diego. Find somebody you don't agree with politically, but have a conversation with them about something, anything you do agree on. Find them, talk about it, get something done. And until next time, keep it civil, San Diego.